Thunder crashed across the rolling Yorkshire moors, shaking the old stone walls of Pemberton Hall as the storm unleashed its fury on the land. Rain pelted the windows in relentless sheets, the wind howling through ancient oaks that had stood for centuries. In the heart of the manor, Lady Victoria Pemberton sat alone in the cavernous library, her slender fingers curled around a half-empty glass of brandy. Shadows danced along the bookshelves as the firelight flickered, casting tall, uncertain shapes on the Persian rug beneath her feet. A year had passed, yet the ache inside her chest felt as fresh as the day it happened. She could still see Henry's gentle smile, the way he would brush the mud from his boots at the doorway, his laughter echoing through these now silent halls. She shut her eyes, breathing in the scent of old leather and wood smoke, willing herself not to drown in the memories. Outside, the storm's rage only seemed to deepen the emptiness within the great house. Sometimes it felt as though the world itself was mourning, crying out for what had been lost. Suddenly, a piercing cry shattered the storm's steady rhythm. It was not human, but something far more primal. The sharp, desperate whinny of a horse, echoed by a frantic clattering of hooves on wet stone. Victoria froze, her heartbeat slamming in her ears. For a second she was 16 again, listening for her father's return after a late hunt. But this was different. The cry filled not just with pain, but with sheer, raw terror. She set her glass down, hand trembling. Her silk dressing gown brushed the armrest as she stood, hesitant. That sound. It conjured images she tried every day to forget. She remembered the night they brought Henry home, lifeless, his riding coat torn and bloodied, the servants unable to meet her gaze. Another flash of lightning illuminated the garden, and the memories came rushing back, too swift to stop. Rain lashed her face as she opened the tall French window, stepping out onto the flagstone terrace. The wind yanked at her hair, cold and wild, but she ignored it. She peered into the darkness, searching for the source of the desperate cries. A jagged bolt of lightning lit up the grounds, revealing a ghostly figure lurching near the old stables. Not a man, a horse, magnificent and imposing even in its distress. Its coat shone a deep chestnut beneath the mud and blood that streaked its flanks. Even from a distance, Victoria could see the animal's eyes, wide and glistening, burning with defiance despite its obvious agony. She hesitated, heart pounding. Logic screamed for her to stay inside. Any sensible person would. But something inside her stirred, a thread of purpose, fragile but undeniable. She turned, grabbed her barber raincoat from its hook, and dashed barefoot across the slick stones, clutching a flashlight in one shaking hand. Each step felt heavier than the last. She skirted the rose garden, thorns snatching at her nightgown. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and crushed petals. The storm's fury beat against her, but she pressed on, boots squelching in the mud as she reached the edge of the paddock. There, the horse reared as she approached, kicking up divots of sodden earth. Its breath steamed in the cold night air, eyes rolling white with fear and pain. Lightning cracked overhead. For an instant, the world was frozen in blue-white brilliance. The broken gate, the mangled fence, blood trickling from a jagged gash along the animal's flank. Victoria's heart twisted. It was as if she were watching Henry die all over again, powerless, alone in the darkness. She forced herself to step forward, holding the light steady. The horse snorted, pawing the ground, but didn't bolt. There was something ancient and noble in the way it held its head, trembling yet proud. Victoria swallowed hard. "Easy now, boy." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, nearly lost in the wind. "You're safe." She knelt in the mud, arms open, letting the flashlight fall. The horse's nostrils flared, muscles tensed as if ready to leap away, but it stayed rooted, watching her with a gaze so intelligent it made her breath catch. In that moment, she felt it, a connection, unspoken, raw. Both of them battered, both haunted by ghosts. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the carved crest above the stable doors. The Pemberton lion, eternal guardian. How many centuries had this house watched over lost souls? Victoria reached out, palm up, offering everything she had left. For a moment, nothing moved except the wind. Then, the horse took one shaky step toward her, then another, until its damp, powerful muzzle brushed her fingers. "That's it, darling," she whispered, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "You're safe with me." She had no idea how she'd care for him, no plan beyond this instant. But as the storm raged on, she stood with the wounded creature, refusing to yield. The world might be falling apart outside these walls, but here, in the trembling dark, two broken souls had found each other. And for the first time in a year, Lady Victoria Pemberton felt a flicker of hope ignite inside her heart. The storm had not yet loosened its grip on Pemberton Hall, as Victoria led the chestnut stallion beneath the ancient stone archway into the old stables. Thunder rumbled overhead, and each flash of lightning revealed how much the years had worn on the building. Ivy clung to the walls, shingles had slipped from the roof, and the scent of musty hay and damp leather filled the air. Victoria's breath came in ragged bursts as she guided the horse, every step a negotiation between fear and resolve. Inside the stable, shadows pooled in the corners, but Victoria wasted no time fumbling for the light. Her hands trembled as she flipped the switch, illuminating a narrow corridor lined with dusty stalls and half-empty feed bins. The horse, sovereign, she thought. Yes, that name fit, regal even in his suffering, stood unsteadily, his flanks heaving. The gash along his side gleamed wet and red beneath the weak light, and each shiver of his powerful body told her how deep the pain ran. "Easy, boy." Her voice was gentle but commanding, a tone she'd learned from years at her father's side in the saddle, a tone that remembered what it meant to lead. She pressed a hand to Sovereign's neck, feeling the wild, terrified hammering of his heart, and she matched her breathing to his, slow and deliberate. Bit by bit, the stallion seemed to calm, though his eyes, huge, obsidian, and impossibly wise, never left hers. She found a faded horse blanket and draped it across his trembling back, then hurried to the tack room, where she dug out a battered first aid kit. Her mind raced with fragments of childhood lessons. Clean the wound. Don't panic. Stay calm for the horse. As she approached with water and a clean rag, Sovereign tossed his head, nostrils flaring. "Shh, it's all right," she murmured, her own hands trembling as much as his legs. She crouched low, never making sudden moves, and dabbed at the wound. The stallion snorted, half threatening to bolt, but then stilled as if realizing she meant no harm. Victoria felt the heat of his breath against her skin, and something inside her, a part that had been frozen for so long, began to thaw. Minutes stretched into hours as she worked, cleaning the gash, staunching the bleeding, soothing Sovereign with quiet words and gentle touches. Rain hammered at the roof, thunder punctuating her efforts, but within the stable, a fragile peace settled. At last, Victoria fetched a bucket of water and a scoop of oats, offering them with outstretched hands. "You must be starving," she said softly. Sovereign's ears twitched, suspicion and hunger warring in his eyes, but hunger won out. He nosed at the oats, crunching them with slow, careful bites, and Victoria watched as the tension in his body began to ease. In that moment, she realized she had not simply saved a horse. She had invited a kindred spirit into her world, someone who understood loss and pain as intimately as she did. The storm raged on outside, the world reduced to a cacophony of wind and rain, but in the stable, time seemed to stand still. Victoria sat on an overturned bucket, brushing stray hay from her nightgown and watching as Sovereign finished his meal. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden and bittersweet, to Henry, to the endless nights she had spent waiting for him to return. The echo of his laughter, the promise in his eyes, the warmth of his hand on hers. She closed her eyes, tears prickling behind her lids. "I wish you could see me now, Henry," she whispered to the darkness. Sovereign, as if sensing her sorrow, stepped closer. He lowered his head, pressing his warm muzzle against her shoulder. Victoria stilled, stunned by the simple comfort of the gesture. She reached up, running her fingers through his tangled mane, and for the first time since Henry's death, she let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, she could move forward. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, the rain easing to a gentle patter. Victoria knew the night could not last forever, but a new day felt impossibly far away. She rose, her joints stiff, and checked the bandage on Sovereign's side. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound was still angry and raw. "I'll be back, I promise," she said, voice steadier now. She refilled his water bucket, fluffed the straw in his stall, and closed the gate with a soft click. As she turned to leave, she hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder. Sovereign stood tall, eyes watchful, every inch the proud stallion he was born to be. There was a challenge in his stare, an unspoken question. Would she come back? Could she be trusted? Victoria nodded, silent but resolute. She stepped into the hallway, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Should she call the local vet? Tell Oliver, the caretaker's clever son, about her midnight rescue? What if the horse's owner came looking, demanding compensation or worse? The world outside felt suddenly complicated, dangerous, and her heart fluttered with both excitement and dread. For the rest of the day, Victoria hovered between hope and uncertainty. She returned to the stable every hour, checking on Sovereign, changing his water, whispering encouragement. Each time she approached, he grew less wary, more willing to accept her touch. She named him aloud, Sovereign, committing to the bond that had begun in the storm. But late that afternoon, as the sun slipped behind gray clouds and the wind returned with a chilly bite, Sovereign's wildness returned. He sniffed the air, ears twitching, and before Victoria could react, he bolted, crashing through the broken fence and vanishing into the misty moors beyond the estate. "No! Wait!" Victoria's cry was lost in the wind. She stood alone, heart pounding, watching the spot where the stallion had disappeared. The pain of loss was sharp and immediate, but beneath it, something new flickered, a sense of possibility, a reason to keep moving forward. The moors had swallowed Sovereign for now, but Victoria knew their story was far from over. For the first time in months, she longed for tomorrow, for the chance to begin again. Something had changed inside her, a sense of purpose, raw and unfinished, waiting just beyond the next storm. The Yorkshire air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and old stone as dawn spilled across the grounds of Pemberton Hall. Victoria stood at the kitchen window, staring out over the mist that curled along the hedgerows and lingered among the rose bushes. A heaviness remained in her chest after the night's events, but something subtle had shifted. She felt it in her bones, a pull to leave the shadows of the manor behind and seek out new beginnings, no matter how uncertain or fragile they seemed. By midday, the sun finally broke through, flooding the estate with pale gold. The storm had passed, and with its departure, Victoria felt the weight of her grief begin to ease. Instead of hiding away in her library, she pulled on her boots and made her way toward the old stable, a basket slung over her arm. Inside, the straw was still damp from Sovereign's presence, hoof prints deep in the mud, a few golden hairs snagged on a nail in the stall door. Her heart twisted with longing, but she refused to let despair win. Victoria set out a fresh bucket of water and a generous heap of oats in the corner stall, careful to keep everything just so. Order, she thought, might invite comfort to return. She even brought a tart apple, sliced and arranged on a chipped china plate. It was a silly gesture, but one that made her smile as she set the offering down. Each afternoon that followed, she repeated the ritual. She'd leave food and water in the old stable, then retreat to the gardens, her favorite book in hand, and wait on the cold stone bench beneath a riot of rose blossoms. The air was thick with the fragrance of blooming petals, and every so often, the wind would carry the faintest echo of hooves in the distance. Victoria would listen, hoping to hear Sovereign's approach, her heart aching with both hope and regret. On the third day, while she waited on her bench, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Good afternoon, Lady Victoria." It was Oliver Hartley, the caretaker's son, lanky and keen-eyed, carrying a bundle of carrots and a shy, earnest smile. He was 16, with the practical hands of a farm boy and a mind always curious for answers. Since his father's illness, Oliver had taken on more and more responsibilities, quietly stepping in to help wherever he could. "I heard about the storm, ma'am, and I saw fresh prints out by the east field, hoof marks, not the usual ones." Victoria studied him, gauging how much to reveal. She trusted Oliver. He had been a constant presence since childhood, running messages and carrying parcels, never once betraying a confidence. "There was a horse," she said, voice quiet. "A stallion. I tried to help him. He's wild, hurt too. I'm not sure if he'll come back." Oliver's eyes widened, then softened with understanding. "Horses remember kindness, Lady Victoria. If you give him space and food, he'll return when he's ready." His words were simple but wise, and Victoria felt her burden lighten just a little. As the days slipped into a rhythm, Sovereign did return, though never while anyone watched. Each morning, Victoria would find the oats gone, water bucket drained, sometimes a fresh print in the muddy straw. The stable grew warmer, more welcoming, the scent of fear replaced by hay and apples. Victoria spoke to Sovereign even when she couldn't see him, reading aloud from poetry books, telling stories of her youth, of riding with Henry through the summer fields. She let the words fill the space, carried by hope and the memory of laughter. Sometimes, when dusk crept along the horizon, Victoria would hear a soft whicker from the darkness and see a flash of chestnut among the trees. Rosin watched her, wary but less afraid, his gaze sharp and curious. She spoke gently to him, never moving too quickly, always leaving a path open for his retreat. The healing went both ways. Each encounter with Sovereign gave Victoria a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Henry's death. She began to wake before dawn, filled with quiet anticipation. The pain in her chest dulled as she busied herself with tasks around the estate, mending fences, planting bulbs, scrubbing saddles that hadn't seen use in months. She even found herself humming, the notes awkward at first, then growing stronger. Oliver became a frequent companion in these days of change. He helped haul feed sacks, repaired the broken fence Sovereign had smashed in his panic, and offered endless bits of advice about horses. He brought news from the village: who was ill, who was traveling, the gossip about the manor's mysterious guest. Victoria found herself laughing more, grateful for the boy's company and the sense of normalcy he brought. One afternoon, Victoria spotted Sovereign closer than ever before. The stallion stood in the shadow of an old oak, his chestnut coat gleaming in the sunlight, eyes fixed on her. Victoria held her breath, heart racing, but this time, Sovereign didn't bolt. She sat quietly on the ground, hands resting in her lap, and began to speak. "I lost someone too, you know. My husband, Henry. I used to think the world ended the day he died, but now I'm not so sure." Sovereign's ears flicked forward, as if he understood. He took a step closer, nostrils flaring at the scent of apple in her palm. Victoria didn't move, letting him come to her in his own time. As weeks passed, Sovereign's wounds slowly healed, the raw gash closing, his steps growing more confident. Trust grew too, woven together from patience and persistence, a fragile bond built one quiet moment at a time. Victoria found herself sharing more, her hopes, her fears, even her old dreams of turning Pemberton Hall into something greater than a monument to loss. The stallion became her silent witness, his dark eyes reflecting every sorrow and every small victory. There were still setbacks, nights when Sovereign wouldn't appear, days when the pain returned, sharp and fresh, but always the promise of another encounter, another chance, pulled Victoria from the darkness. With every gentle touch and every careful word, Victoria and Sovereign taught each other how to begin again. Out of pain and silence, something new was taking root. Not just survival, but the possibility of joy, waiting to be claimed beneath the broad Yorkshire sky. By midsummer, the world around Pemberton Hall seemed to breathe again, as if the earth itself was ready for a new story. Sunlight filtered through ancient oaks, splashing gold onto gravel paths, and wild roses tumbled across iron gates in fragrant profusion. Victoria awoke each day to the distant coo of wood pigeons and the hum of bees in the gardens. The manor, once a mausoleum of memories, began to feel like home again. Each morning she made her rounds, first to the old stable, where Sovereign now waited with an almost dignified patience, ears pricked forward at the sound of her approach. The stallion's wounds had healed, leaving only a silvery scar beneath his chestnut coat. He moved with the lithe grace of a born racer, but there was a new gentleness in the way he accepted oats from Victoria's palm, and a silent understanding in the way he stood beside her, his breath warm against her shoulder. Oliver, ever practical and good-natured, had become her right hand. Together they repaired the fences along the paddocks, weeded the vegetable patch, and cared for the other animals left behind in the wake of loss. Some days, Victoria found herself laughing aloud as Oliver recounted tales of the village: the vicar's missing cat, a neighbor's prize pumpkin, a choir scandal involving an out-of-tune organ. She marveled at how the simplest moments, once taken for granted, now glimmered with meaning, but it was the afternoons that felt most magical. After lunch, Victoria opened the manor gates to children from the village, inviting them to explore the gardens, learn about the estate's history, and, most thrilling of all, meet sovereign. The stallion, though wary at first, soon grew used to gentle hands and awed whispers. He became the silent star of these small gatherings, his intelligence and regal bearing enchanting everyone who saw him. Victoria watched as laughter filled the air, echoing through the rose garden and beneath the old clock tower. She knew Henry would have approved. She imagined his spirit smiling, watching her reclaim both her home and her joy. Yet beneath the tranquility, a tremor of anxiety lingered. Oliver, sharp-eyed as ever, was the first to voice it as they brushed Sovereign's coat one evening. "He's no ordinary horse, ma'am," he said, pausing to study the stallion's elegant profile. "The way he carries himself, I'd wager he belonged to a racing stable." "A fine one at that," Victoria nodded, remembering the night Sovereign first appeared, wild and bloodied, yet unmistakably noble. She glanced at the faint brand on his flank, a clue she'd ignored in her hurry to save him. "I think you're right, Oliver. Perhaps he escaped, or was abandoned." She hesitated. "Either way, he found his way here." They stood in silence, watching as Sovereign grazed contentedly in the fading light. Victoria's thoughts turned often to the future. She dreamed of fulfilling the vision she and Henry had shared, turning Pemberton Hall into a place of learning and sanctuary, a refuge for lost animals and lost souls alike. She began sketching plans in her journal, imagining workshops on art and literature, history tours for school children, and gentle riding lessons for anyone brave enough to climb into a saddle. Every new idea gave her life a sense of direction that had been missing for so long. As the weeks went by, Victoria noticed a change not just in herself, but in Sovereign. The stallion seemed to sense her moods, nudging her arm when she was quiet, pressing his forehead to hers when sadness threatened to return. She confided in him as she had once confided in Henry, whispering her fears and dreams into the twilight. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and almost believe Henry was listening too, that his spirit lived on in every leaf and sunbeam that blessed the old estate. One golden evening, as the sky turned lavender and gold, Victoria sat beneath the great oak at the paddock's edge, Sovereign standing sentinel beside her. She traced the outline of the house on a scrap of paper, imagining its halls filled with laughter and learning. The thought brought a gentle ache, a longing for what might yet be. "You know, Henry always wanted Pemberton Hall to be more than just a house," she said softly, as if her husband could hear her. "He dreamed of creating something lasting, something generous. Maybe it's time I honored that dream." Sovereign snorted, almost in agreement, and nuzzled her arm with unexpected tenderness. But peace, Victoria knew, could be fragile. She caught glimpses of the outside world pressing in, rumors from Oliver about men in suits visiting the village, inquiries about the estate's boundaries and its ownership. At night, she found herself pacing the long halls, haunted by a sense of impending change. The tranquility she had worked so hard to build felt suddenly precarious, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the next gust of wind to scatter her careful plans. Still, she refused to retreat into fear. Instead, Victoria doubled her efforts to connect with the community, opening Pemberton Hall's doors to neighbors for Sunday teas, sharing her plans for restoration and education, seeking allies in her vision for the future. Oliver, proud and fiercely loyal, supported her every step, his youthful optimism balancing her cautious hope. It was during one of these late afternoon gatherings that Victoria looked out across the lawn, Sovereign grazing in the long grass, children's laughter ringing in the air, and felt a moment of rare, exquisite happiness. Here, for just a heartbeat, The pain of loss faded, replaced by gratitude for the new life unfolding all around her. Yet even as she savored the peace, Victoria knew storms never truly disappeared. They simply circled at the edges of the sky, waiting for the right moment to return. And as she gazed toward the horizon, where fields met forest, and the light grew long and uncertain, she sensed that her greatest test was still to come. The morning sky was a flawless blue, the kind of rare, cloudless brilliance that made the fields of Yorkshire shimmer like emerald velvet. Victoria had risen early, humming as she swept through her routines: oats for Sovereign, a basket of strawberries for Oliver, fresh-cut roses arranged in a vase for the library. There was a gentle sense of order in every act, as if each day built another layer of protection against the ghosts that once haunted her every waking moment. She was finishing her second cup of tea in the sunroom, the air warm and sweet with the scent of honeysuckle, when the sound of engines shattered the quiet. Victoria stilled, the china cup poised mid-air. Engines, plural, not the steady chug of Oliver's old motorbike, but a convoy, deep-voiced and expensive. Her pulse quickened. She crossed to the window, drawing aside the lace curtain with trembling fingers. 3 gleaming vehicles crested the long gravel drive: 2 black sedans and a glossy silver Land Rover. Their tires crunched across the stones, scattering doves from the fountain. Victoria's heart slammed against her ribs as the front doors opened and men stepped out, all in tailored suits and polished shoes that did not belong in the country. At their center, unmistakable in his Savile Row finery and air of arrogant confidence, stood Sir Nathaniel Pemberton. He was older than Henry by 7 years, but he wore his age as if it were a trophy. Every gray hair carefully in place, every gesture practiced. His eyes swept the grounds with a cold calculation that made Victoria's skin crawl. He looked at the estate not with the love of family, but the hunger of a man appraising a prize to be won or sold. Nathaniel led his entourage toward the front steps with the swagger of a general, pausing only to bark an order at a pair of surveyors who began unloading camera equipment and bulky portfolios. Victoria forced herself upright, shoulders squared, jaw set. She had not survived the loss of Henry and rebuilt her life just to watch it be measured and priced by outsiders. The butler met her at the threshold, face pale. "Sir Nathaniel is here, my lady," he managed, eyes downcast. "With company." "I see that," Victoria replied, voice steady, though inside she trembled. She stepped outside, meeting the group at the top of the stairs. Nathaniel smiled, but the gesture never reached his eyes. "Victoria, you're looking well?" His tone was smooth as silk, but there was a razor's edge beneath. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice cool but civil, "to what do I owe this visit?" He spread his arms as if embracing an old friend. "Family business, of course, and business is the right word, I'm afraid." He nodded at the men flanking him. "These are surveyors and property valuers from London. I've taken the liberty of arranging an appraisal of Pemberton Hall. It's time, I think, to discuss its future." Victoria's mouth went dry. She glanced at the surveyors, already measuring distances, scribbling notes. One man snapping photos of the stables and the old rose garden. "The future of Pemberton Hall is not yours to decide," she replied, her temper rising. Nathaniel's smile sharpened. But the law may disagree. As you know, with Henry's unfortunate passing and no male heir, the estate's title is not as secure as you might hope. I have documents, Victoria. Rights, inherited and lawful, and I have interested parties, developers, investors, who see the potential for something grander than this. museum of memories. Victoria's hands curled into fists. She could barely hear the rest. Words like joint ownership, redevelopment, liquidity, and market value swirled around her like flies. "And should I refuse?" she asked, her voice tight. Nathaniel leaned in, lowering his voice to a hiss. "You can refuse, certainly, but I have legal counsel ready to contest your every move. And I hear there have been irregularities in your use of the land." He let the word hang, his gaze drifting toward the old stables where Sovereign stood in the paddock, mane glinting in the sun. For instance, an unregistered animal on the property. Such things can complicate matters. If the authorities were to hear of this, it might make your position even more precarious. Victoria followed his gaze, a cold surge of fear slicing through her chest. Sovereign, sensing the tension, tossed his head and whinnied, stamping the ground with a nervous hoof. One of the surveyors lifted a camera, snapping pictures of the horse, the stable, the fencing. "Leave Sovereign out of this," Victoria said, stepping between Nathaniel and the view. "He's not your concern." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "On the contrary, any valuable asset on the estate is of concern to me. That horse is worth a small fortune to the right buyer, or a problem for the local authorities if he's not properly accounted for." A sickening dread settled in Victoria's stomach. It was clear now. Nathaniel intended not just to claim the house, but everything she loved within its walls. Every rose bush, every stone, every living creature could be reduced to a figure on a ledger. The surveyors moved swiftly, marking boundaries, inspecting outbuildings, their eyes everywhere. Victoria felt stripped bare, as if her entire life was being catalogued for sale. She fought to keep her composure, dismissing the surveyors with sharp words, demanding that Nathaniel provide documentation before setting foot further on the property. But the damage was done. The day ended in bitter silence, the taste of defeat lingering as Nathaniel and his men finally retreated, promising to return with lawyers. That night, Victoria sat in the library staring at the empty hearth. Sovereign lay in the paddock, restless beneath the stars. Oliver knocked quietly, offering tea, but she barely tasted it. For the first time since the storm had brought Sovereign to her door, Victoria felt the future slipping from her grasp. The estate, her home, and her hard-won peace, all at risk from the ambitions of a man who saw nothing but profit in her world. But as the firelight flickered, Victoria's resolve hardened. She had fought through grief, through loneliness and loss. She would fight again, this time for Pemberton Hall, for Sovereign, for every dream she and Henry had ever shared. The days after Nathaniel's assault on Pemberton Hall passed like a fever dream, full of frantic activity, cold dread, and a new, stubborn fire burning inside Victoria. Gone was the gentle rhythm of mornings with Sovereign and afternoons in the rose garden. In its place, Victoria found herself swept up in meetings, paperwork, and phone calls that seemed to echo the relentless clatter of Nathaniel's surveyors through her mind. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She walked the long halls of the manor at night, listening for every creak, every distant bark of a fox or thunder of hooves, as if waiting for the walls themselves to betray her. Yet she refused to be driven from her home. Oliver was the first to speak up, finding her one morning hunched over stacks of legal papers at the breakfast table. "You can't do this alone, Lady Victoria. You need help. Real help." He stood there, clutching his cap, eyes wide with worry but stubborn as ever. Victoria forced a smile, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "I know, Oliver, and I will. I promise." She reached for the telephone. her hands shaking as she dialed the number she hadn't called in years, a number for a woman she'd admired from afar, but had never thought she'd need. Charlotte Whitmore answered on the second ring. Her voice was brisk, almost impatient, until she recognized Victoria's name. "Lady Pemberton? What a surprise. I take it this isn't a social call." "No, it isn't. I need your help." Victoria's voice broke, but she pressed on. "My late husband's brother, Nathaniel. He's come for the estate. He brought surveyors, lawyers, investors. He claims the title isn't secure because Henry died without a male heir. He's threatening to have Sovereign, my horse, seized as an illegal animal. I'm afraid he'll take everything." A silence. Then Charlotte's voice softened, full of quiet steel. "I'm on my way. I'll be there by tomorrow." And so, just after noon the next day, a low-slung Aston Martin swept up the drive, sending pebbles flying. Charlotte Whitmore emerged, tall, composed, every inch the London barrister, her presence slicing through the uncertainty that had gripped Pemberton Hall. She shook Victoria's hand firmly. "Let's get to work." They spread out the deeds, the letters, the family records across the library table. Charlotte read through everything, brow furrowed, her pencil tapping a rapid, nervous rhythm. She asked pointed questions, made notes, then fixed Victoria with a piercing gaze. "He's got a case, Victoria, but so do you. Henry may have died intestate, but you are his lawful widow, and you've maintained the estate. Did Henry ever speak of a trust or alternate will?" Victoria hesitated. She remembered, suddenly, an old chest in Henry's study, half buried under files and writing tack. She rose and hurried upstairs, Charlotte close behind. Dust motes spun in the sunlight as Victoria unlocked the chest. Inside, beneath a stack of crumbling ledgers, she found it, a draft of a will in Henry's careful hand, leaving the estate to Victoria and establishing a trust for its preservation. "It's not signed by a lawyer. He must have meant to finish it, but—" Her voice faded as tears threatened. Charlotte took the draft, eyes narrowing. "It's not a binding will, but it's evidence. Intent counts for something, especially if we can find corroborating proof. Letters, emails, anything from Henry showing his wishes." As the days passed, Charlotte launched her own investigation, reaching out to Henry's solicitor in York, searching for any overlooked correspondence. Victoria and Oliver combed through desk drawers, trunks, and old suit jackets, finding receipts and notes, birthday cards and invitations, fragments of a life lived fully until it wasn't. Meanwhile, Nathaniel grew bolder. He returned with his own lawyer, demanding meetings in the front parlor, his tone smug and insistent. "My client asserts his right to joint ownership," Nathaniel's attorney declared, waving documents with the Pemberton seal. "The property's upkeep is unsustainable for one person. My client is prepared to sell his share to interested developers, unless Lady Victoria wishes to buy him out." At market rate, of course, Victoria bristled. "I will never sell Pemberton Hall. Not to you, not to anyone. This estate is not a business, it's a legacy," Nathaniel's lawyer shrugged. "The courts may see it differently," he warned. The tension grew, as if every stone of the manor vibrated with anxiety. Surveyors roamed the grounds, taking measurements, inspecting outbuildings, muttering into cell phones. Neighbors in the village whispered, some expressing sympathy, others eyeing Pemberton Hall with a new, speculative hunger. Victoria felt their stares whenever she ventured into town. She saw the news spreading, rumors of financial trouble, of legal battles, of an estate on the brink. One rainy evening, as the sky pressed low and gray against the windows, Charlotte appeared in the library doorway. I found something. She held up a letter, its seal broken, edges worn with age. It's from Henry, addressed to his solicitor. He clearly states his intent to leave everything to you. The date matches the draft of the will. It's not ironclad, but it's significant. If we can prove Nathaniel's attempts to force a sale are financially motivated, perhaps even in bad faith, our case is much stronger. Victoria's heart surged with hope, but fear coiled close behind. She thought of Sovereign, grazing in the paddock, and how easily everything could be taken by a single legal ruling. That night, she stood at the window, watching as lightning flickered over the fields. The battle lines were drawn now, not just in court, but in the hearts of everyone who called Pemberton Hall home. The house felt alive, watching, waiting. Victoria gripped the windowsill and whispered a silent vow. I will not let you down, Henry. I will fight. For our home. For our future. For every living thing that belongs here. And in the shadows beyond the glass, Sovereign lifted his head, as if hearing her promise and understanding that, come what may, he was no longer alone. The rain returned to Yorkshire with a vengeance, slamming against the old stones of Pemberton Hall and turning the paddocks to churned mud. Victoria watched the weather from the library window, her nerves taut as violin strings. She sensed the storm in more than the sky. She felt it in every harsh word exchanged with Nathaniel's legal team, every threatening letter that arrived by post, every sideways glance from villagers now more curious than supportive. Each day the legal battle dragged on. Her hope wavered between steel and smoke. But that night, it wasn't Nathaniel or any lawyer who came for her world. It was the storm. Lightning flashed, a white-hot nerve splitting the darkness, and a crash of thunder shook the window panes. Victoria tried to focus on the documents Charlotte had left, each line of legalese a wall she clung to in hopes of saving Pemberton Hall. But her concentration shattered when she heard the unmistakable, terrified whinny from the direction of the stables. Her heart lurched. She dropped her pen, racing for her raincoat, boots slapping against the marble floor. Oliver, always alert, appeared from the hallway, worry etched across his face. "It's Sovereign," he gasped. "Something's wrong." I heard a crash. Victoria didn't wait for an explanation. Together they sprinted into the storm, the wind nearly knocking them sideways as they crossed the courtyard. The paddock gate hung crooked, rain pelting down, and in the darkness she saw a blur of movement, a chestnut shape thrashing, frantic, against the boundary fence. "Sovereign, no!" Victoria called out, voice breaking as she vaulted the gate. The stallion reared, wild-eyed, his flanks slick with mud and something darker, blood. Panic twisted through her. "Easy, boy, please, I'm here." She moved slowly, ignoring the sting of rain on her skin. Sovereign's body trembled, his eyes rolling white, a deep gash along his side open and bleeding anew. Oliver appeared at her side, lantern in hand, shining the beam over the chaos. Hoofprints, splintered rails, the evidence of a desperate, terrified flight. "Someone spooked him," Oliver whispered. "I saw lights earlier, near the trees." The implications chilled Victoria more than the storm itself. Who would creep onto the grounds in this weather? Who would want to drive Sovereign into panic? As she pressed her palm gently to Sovereign's neck, she realized with sick certainty that this was not an accident. Nathaniel, unable to break her resolve in court, had tried to break her spirit through the animal she loved. "I need the vet! Now!" Victoria shouted. Oliver was gone in an instant, sprinting toward the main house to call for help. Victoria knelt beside Sovereign as the storm raged around them. Each breath from the horse was labored, his muscles twitching in pain. She tore strips from her sleeve, pressing them to the wound as she whispered nonsense, comfort, prayers, anything to keep herself anchored. The memory of losing Henry, of helplessness and blood on her hands, threatened to pull her under. "Stay with me, Sovereign," she pleaded. "Please don't leave me too." Time blurred. Rain poured down, thunder shaking the earth. The world shrank to the circle of lantern light and the sound of Sovereign's ragged breathing. At last, the veterinarian arrived, soaked and harried, his face grave as he examined the wound. "He's lost a lot of blood," the vet murmured, voice barely audible over the rain. "But he's strong. I'll do what I can." They worked for hours in the makeshift infirmary Oliver and Victoria created in the old tack room. Charlotte, roused by the commotion, helped as best she could, fetching clean towels and boiling water. Sovereign's sides heaved with every injection and bandage, his eyes glazed but always flicking to Victoria, as if begging her not to give up. Finally, exhausted, Victoria leaned against the wall, staring at the stallion who had become so much more than a stray, her friend, her confidant, the living heartbeat of hope inside Pemberton Hall. "This was deliberate," Charlotte said softly, her jaw set. "If Nathaniel's people did this, he's not just after your land, Victoria. He'll do anything to win." The fury that rose inside Victoria burned away her fear. The legal battle was no longer abstract. It was flesh and blood. It was survival, and it would not end here. Sovereign's recovery was slow. He slept for hours, sweating and shivering, sometimes so still Victoria's heart stopped until she saw the twitch of his ear or the flutter of his nostrils. She never left his side, sometimes dozing on a bale of straw, sometimes talking to him through the darkness. Yet even in pain, Sovereign's eyes remained bright, proud, wild, full of a spirit that could not be broken. Victoria began to realize that her fight for Pemberton Hall was mirrored in this creature's battle for life. If he could endure, so could she. The storm finally passed, leaving the world washed clean and strangely quiet. Birds sang at dawn, hesitant at first, then louder, braver. Sovereign raised his head and nickered, faint but alive. Victoria laughed, a hoarse, tearful sound of relief. But as she opened the stable door to let in the morning sun, she saw the muddy footprints along the fence, the broken boards, the way someone had tampered with the latch. There was no more denying it. Nathaniel was willing to destroy anything and anyone who stood in his way. Victoria stroked Sovereign's face, meeting his gaze. "I won't let him win," she whispered, fiercer than she'd ever known herself to be. "You're safe, I promise. And so is our home." But deep down, Victoria knew the storm had only just begun. The days that followed Sovereign's injury were thick with tension, the atmosphere at Pemberton Hall electric and brittle, as if the very air might shatter at the slightest provocation. Victoria kept vigil at the stable, barely leaving Sovereign's side except for brief, anxious check-ins with Charlotte and Oliver. The legal storm outside had grown as fierce as the real one, and now she was fighting on two fronts: against Nathaniel's lawyers in the courtroom and his underhanded tactics in her own backyard. Charlotte moved through the manor with brisk efficiency, a stack of legal files always tucked under one arm and her cell phone buzzing nonstop. She'd become more than just an attorney in these weeks. She was a confidant, a shield, and, Victoria realized, a true friend. It was Charlotte who organized the evidence, drawing connections between Nathaniel's business failures and his sudden interest in the estate, tracing wire transfers and property offers, building a case of not just greed, but desperation. Oliver, ever resourceful, patrolled the grounds each night with a flashlight and Sovereign's old crop as a makeshift baton. The boy's loyalty never wavered, even as the pressure mounted. It was Oliver who discovered the first clue that would unravel Nathaniel's scheme. A discarded flashlight, mud-caked and still faintly glowing, at the edge of the paddock. Victoria's gratitude for him grew into a fierce, protective love. He was as much her family as any blood relation ever could be. But the breakthrough came not from the stables or the house, but in an old tin box, buried in a drawer of Henry's battered writing desk. It was Oliver who found it, thumbing through the contents on a rainy afternoon. He brought it to Victoria and Charlotte, his hands trembling with excitement. "I think you'll want to see this." Inside the box were Henry's letters, dozens of them, some written to Victoria in his bold, looping hand, but others addressed to Henry's solicitor and even to Charlotte's family. The final letter, yellowed and fragile, bore the date just a week before Henry's death. In it, Henry detailed his wishes for the estate, naming Victoria as sole heir and expressing a clear intent to preserve Pemberton Hall as a sanctuary and cultural site. He even mentioned his fear that Nathaniel would try to overturn his wishes, urging his solicitor to take every step necessary to ensure Victoria's security. Charlotte read the letter twice, her usual composure slipping for a moment as she looked up. This changes everything." Her voice was low, almost reverent. "It's not just intent, it's instructions written to a lawyer. This is as good as a will." A tremor of relief passed through Victoria, but it was soon replaced by the steady rise of hope, a cautious, dangerous hope that perhaps all was not lost. But the biggest twist came as Charlotte studied another letter in the pile. A brief, businesslike note with a name she recognized. Whitmore Stables. The address was that of her own family's horse farm, famous for breeding Arabian racers. The contents confirmed what Oliver had long suspected. Sovereign wasn't a stray or a lost workhorse, but a purebred Arabian from the Whitmore line, missing since a burglary months ago. Sovereign is mine, or rather, my family's," Charlotte murmured, stunned. "But you rescued him, Victoria. And I see how he's healed here. How he's healed you, too." Victoria stared at Charlotte, the weight of everything pressing in. "If he's legally yours, does that mean?" "It means I could demand his return." "But I won't," Charlotte said simply, a rare smile touching her lips. "He belongs with you now. You both needed rescuing, and you found each other." As if to confirm this, Sovereign raised his head and let out a soft, rumbling nicker from his stall. Victoria reached for Charlotte's hand, her gratitude beyond words. Armed with the letters, Charlotte called Henry's old solicitor in York. Within days, the man arrived with his own files, correspondence, drafts, legal notes, all pointing to Henry's intent and reinforcing the authenticity of the documents. Suddenly, the case was no longer a desperate defense, but a powerful offense. In the village, news of the impending court hearing spread like wildfire. Some gossiped, others offered support, and a handful of those once indifferent rallied to Victoria's side, stirred by the courage she showed through adversity. Oliver's mother, once shy and withdrawn, arrived at the kitchen door with a basket of scones and a promise to testify to Victoria's stewardship of the estate. Even the vicar pledged to speak on her behalf, recalling Henry's vision for Pemberton Hall as a place of refuge and learning. The day of the hearing dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with threat. Charlotte and Victoria sat side by side at the polished table, their stacks of evidence neatly organized, their nerves raw but steady. Nathaniel entered the courtroom surrounded by his legal team, their confidence shaken but still simmering with entitlement. As the proceedings began, Charlotte spoke with a calm authority that commanded attention. She presented Henry's final letter, the testimony of his solicitor, and a parade of local supporters who attested to Victoria's role as caretaker and steward. Nathaniel's team tried every trick, questioning the letter's authenticity, impugning Victoria's management, even hinting at her irrational attachment to the horse in the paddock. But then Charlotte called Oliver to the stand. The boy's testimony was clear, honest, and devastating, recounting the night of the break-in, the care Victoria had shown to Sovereign, and the men he'd seen lurking by the fence. When asked directly if he believed Nathaniel's men had caused the horse's injury, Oliver didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir, I saw them. They were trying to scare Sovereign. They didn't care if he got hurt." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, Nathaniel looked away. At last, Charlotte stood to give her closing statement. "Lady Victoria Pemberton has honored her late husband's wishes in word and deed. She's preserved this estate, cared for its living creatures, and inspired a community. This is not a simple matter of inheritance, but of legacy, and of doing what is right." There was a long, tense pause as the judge reviewed the documents, the testimonies, and at last, the letters. Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. She gripped Charlotte's hand, praying. The gavel came down. On judgment for Lady Victoria Pemberton, the estate remains hers, and all claims by Sir Nathaniel are dismissed. The words echoed through the chamber, a thunderclap of justice that left Victoria dazed with relief. Nathaniel's lawyers shuffled their papers in defeat, and Nathaniel himself glared, beaten, his schemes finally exposed for all to see. Later, as the family returned to Pemberton Hall, Sovereign trotted out to greet them, his wounds now only scars, a living symbol of resilience and victory. Victoria threw her arms around his neck, laughter and tears mingling in the spring air. Oliver grinned, Charlotte squeezed her shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Victoria looked to the future unafraid. But she knew the hardest choice still lay ahead. She saw it in Sovereign's wise eyes, a longing not just for safety, but for freedom. Spring sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting the grounds of Pemberton Hall in a soft, forgiving glow. The air held a sweetness Victoria hadn't felt in years, a quiet promise that pain could finally give way to peace. The legal battles were over. Nathaniel's shadow no longer stretched across her home. The estate, battered but unbroken, stood ready for a new chapter. Yet in Victoria's heart, a storm still brewed, gentler than before, but just as real. Sovereign's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Each morning, Victoria found him standing strong in the paddock, his coat gleaming. The angry wounds faded into a pale reminder of the cruelty he'd endured. Yet as the days grew warmer and the wounds closed, she saw a restlessness growing in his eyes. It was subtle at first, a pricking of his ears toward the distant hills, a nervous toss of his mane at the scent of wild grass carried on the breeze. He'd pace the fence line at dusk, nostrils flaring, as if listening to music only he could hear. Victoria tried to ignore it. She filled his days with affection, long walks across the grounds, and quiet conversations beneath the old oak. She brushed his coat until it shone, whispered all her gratitude and hope into his twitching ears. But Sovereign's spirit was too big for these boundaries, and she knew it. He had given her so much, a sense of purpose, the courage to fight, the reminder that love could heal, but she could not ask him to sacrifice his freedom for her comfort. One afternoon, Victoria stood at the edge of the field watching Sovereign run. He was poetry in motion, muscles rippling, mane streaming, the joy of movement written in every stride. The villagers who gathered at the fence to admire him could not look away. Neither could Victoria. The more she watched, the more certain she became. It was wrong to keep him, no matter how much she wanted to. She found herself wandering the halls at night, haunted by memories of Henry, of the dreams they once shared. She remembered his words, spoken in the hush of their bedroom, when they first dreamed of turning the estate into a sanctuary. "We don't own this land, Victoria. We're only its stewards, for as long as we're able." The same goes for every living soul we care for. Henry had believed in freedom, his own, hers, and even the wild animals that wandered onto their land. Victoria smiled through tears, grateful for the clarity that came with grief. In the morning, she found Oliver in the stables, repairing a loose plank. He looked up at her, understanding written in the lines of his young face. "You're going to let him go, aren't you?" he said quietly. Victoria nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "He deserves to be wild, Oliver, to run where he pleases, to be more than just a symbol of my pain." Oliver nodded, squeezing her hand. "He'll come back if he wants." Horses remember kindness. Charlotte joined them that afternoon, her legal work complete, her presence now that of a friend rather than an advocate. She listened as Victoria shared her decision, her eyes shining with respect. "True love isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go," Charlotte said softly. Together, they prepared for the farewell. Victoria spent the day with Sovereign, walking the fields, stopping often to rest her head against his warm neck, whispering memories and hopes she hadn't dared to share before. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet, she led Sovereign down the old lane, past the rose gardens, past the pond where she and Henry had once picnicked. At the edge of the estate, where the boundary gate opened onto the endless Yorkshire moor, Victoria paused. Her hands shook as she unbuckled Sovereign's halter, letting it fall into the grass. She stroked his face one last time, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Go on, Sovereign. Be free. Thank you for saving me." Sovereign hesitated, his breath warm against her cheek. For a long moment, he simply stood there, dark eyes locked with hers, as if understanding the depth of her love and the sacrifice she was making. Then, with a toss of his head, he turned and trotted out onto the open land. He paused once at the crest of the hill, silhouetted against the dying sun, then broke into a gallop, vanishing into the wild, untamed world he was always meant to roam. Victoria's knees buckled, and she knelt in the grass, letting her tears fall. Tears not of grief, but of release, of gratitude, of hope finally realized. Oliver came to stand beside her, silent and strong, and together they watched the horizon until night crept in. In the days that followed, Victoria found the estate quieter, yet never empty. She felt Sovereign's spirit everywhere, in the whisper of the wind, in the scent of wildflowers blooming along the paths, in the laughter that now echoed through the halls as neighbors and friends came to visit. She grieved, but it was a cleansing sorrow, free of regret. Slowly, she realized that her love for Sovereign and for Henry had changed her. She was no longer the lonely widow haunting her husband's library. She was the protector of a legacy, a woman strong enough to fight for her dreams and gentle enough to let them go when the time was right. Pemberton Hall began to flourish. Victoria established the Pemberton Foundation, opening the estate to the public for education, sanctuary, and history. Children learned to ride horses on the same fields where Sovereign had once run, and lost animals found safety in the stables. Oliver became her right hand, growing into a confident young man. Charlotte remained a steadfast friend, always ready with advice or a sharp retort to any threat that dared reappear. And sometimes, at dawn or twilight, Victoria would wander to the boundary gate, searching the horizon. Occasionally, she'd spot a chestnut figure moving among the shadows, wild and beautiful and utterly free. She'd smile, whispering a blessing to the wind, knowing that Sovereign was exactly where he belonged. And so at last was she. 6 months had passed since the day Victoria set Sovereign free on the windswept moors. Yorkshire was shifting once more, the seasons painting the countryside with gold and scarlet, then fading gently into the cool hush of early winter. Each morning, frost dusted the ancient stones of Pemberton Hall, catching sunlight that glimmered like diamonds on every windowsill. The great house, once heavy with grief and silence, now pulsed with life and purpose. Victoria stood at the bay window in the drawing room, watching a group of children cross the grounds, their laughter bright as bells. The estate, now fully established as the Pemberton Foundation, bustled with activity. Workshops on history and art, school groups touring the rose gardens, volunteers tending the stables. What had once been a place of sorrow was now a center of joy and discovery. Visitors came from villages and cities alike, drawn by the promise of heritage and hope. There were moments when Victoria caught herself pausing in the halls, half expecting Henry to appear, smiling at the sight of dreams fulfilled. She missed him, of course. Grief never disappeared. It simply changed shape, softening until it was only a quiet ache in her chest, a gentle memory that no longer stole her breath. Sometimes she spoke to him in the hush of evening, recounting the day's triumphs and challenges, telling him about the foundation, about Oliver's progress, about Sovereign, always about Sovereign. Oliver had flourished under Victoria's guidance. No longer the shy boy on the edge of every scene, he had become the Foundation's assistant manager, trusted by staff and guests alike. He led tours for the local school children, teaching them the history of the hall and the wild beauty of the land. Under Victoria's patient mentorship, Oliver's confidence blossomed. The villagers who had once doubted his worth now praised his knowledge and dedication. Charlotte, too, remained a fixture at Pemberton Hall. Her legal acumen was still called upon from time to time. There were always small disputes or issues with neighboring properties. But more often, she and Victoria shared long talks in the library, debates over the best way to expand the Foundation's outreach, and late-night laughter over mugs of strong tea. The bond between them had grown into a rare and enduring friendship, one built on trust and hard-won respect. Sir Nathaniel, meanwhile, had faded from their lives, his pride and fortune both depleted. After the judge's decision, he had been forced to sell off several assets to cover his debts, retiring to a modest flat in London where, rumor had it, he lived in bitterness and quiet regret. No one at Pemberton Hall spoke of him much anymore. His chapter in their story had closed. As winter approached, Victoria made a habit of walking the grounds at dusk, her footsteps silent on the frosty grass. Each evening, she paused at the edge of the moor, the boundary where she had set Sovereign free. Sometimes, if she stood very still, she would catch a glimpse. A flicker of movement on the horizon, the shape of a chestnut stallion standing tall and proud against the setting sun. She never called to him, never tried to lure him back. It was enough to know he was alive, wild, and utterly himself. There were days when Victoria still missed his presence, the heavy warmth of his body at her side, the sound of his breath in the quiet stable, the way his eyes had seemed to look right through her, seeing every sorrow and every hope. But she understood now that Sovereign's gift was not in staying, but in teaching her how to let go. One gray morning, as she sat with Oliver and Charlotte by the fire, a little girl from the village climbed into her lap, clutching a stuffed horse. "Lady Victoria, why did you let Sovereign go?" The child's question was innocent, but it struck Victoria with surprising force. She considered her answer, looking around at the faces she loved, the friends, the children, the community that had grown from pain and sacrifice. "Because love isn't about holding tight to what we're afraid to lose," Victoria replied, her voice gentle. "Sometimes, real love means giving someone the freedom to be who they truly are, even if it means letting them go." The girl nodded, pondering this, then scampered off, satisfied. Charlotte smiled, and Oliver squeezed Victoria's hand. The moment settled around them, quiet and profound. In the months that followed, Pemberton Hall's reputation grew. The estate became known not just for its history, but for its spirit, a place where people and animals alike found second chances. Stories of Sovereign, the wild Arabian who had healed a grieving widow and then vanished into legend, spread across Yorkshire, inspiring all who heard them. Victoria received letters from near and far, from widows and veterans, teachers and children, all seeking advice, comfort, or simply to share their gratitude for the lesson her story had taught. That grief can transform into hope, that letting go can sometimes be the greatest form of love, and that the truest legacies are those we leave not in possessions, but in kindness and courage. On the anniversary of Henry's death, Victoria stood in the rose garden, the winter sun weak but persistent. She placed a hand on the sundial, tracing the inscription he'd chosen. To love and to let go, both require courage. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of cold earth and memory. "Thank you, Henry, for everything," she whispered. A distant whinny echoed across the moors, so faint it might have been the wind. But Victoria smiled, knowing in her heart that Sovereign was out there, running wild and free, a living symbol of every lesson she had learned. Pemberton Hall stood strong, not because its walls had never been shaken, but because they had survived and sheltered hope through every storm. And as the first stars appeared over the Yorkshire hills, Victoria understood at last that her story and Sovereign's, and even Henry's, would never truly end. Their love, unpossessive, brave, and honest, had become part of the land itself, ready to shelter every lost and wandering soul who came seeking a place to begin again.